Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Still Faithful podcast. I am your host, Andrew Robinson, the founder of the Still Faithful Project and the host of the Still Faithful podcast. Today, we are joined by Colonel Thomas Remfer. Colonel Tom Buzz Remfer, U.S. Air Force retired, ended his military career instructing and evaluating MQ-1 Predator and MQ-9 Reaper missions. Past flying assignments included duty in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe as an F-16 flight lead, F-117 instructor pilot, C-130 aircraft commander, and A-10 forward air controller, with a total flight time of over 5,500 hours. He earned a master's degree through the Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Homeland Defense and Security and received a Program's Outstanding Thesis Award. He also served on the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff Cyberspace Task Force. Colonel Remfer was a distinguished graduate from pilot training in the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he was an all-American boxer. Colonel Remfer served in a retired capacity on the Military Advisory Council for Representative Ann Kirkpatrick, Democrat, Arizona, 2nd District, and the Truth for Health Foundation, a 501c3 public charity. We've also interviewed an individual who is affiliated with that same charity, Major Gary. He was our first guest on the Still Faithful podcast. Tom's civilian career as a commercial airline pilot included flying the B787, B777, B767, B757, B737, A300, DC-10, MD-80, and ATR-442 aircraft. Plus, he volunteered with his airline pilot union to assist with aerodynamical and disability matters. Over several decades, Colonel Remfer dutifully challenged illegal DoD mandates as well as reprisal and was vindicated by federal courts and the DoD's Inspector General. Buzz continues to crisscross the oceans, never veering from his course, telling his and Russ Dingle's unyielding story to a captive audience of gracious pilots. Unyielding, his book, details this story of discovery regarding two lab leaks 20 years apart. The 2001 Anthrax letter attacks launched to save the vaccine program according to the FBI, and the 2019 SARS-CoV-2 lab leak, subsequently leveraged to force COVID injections on the world. Buzz's unyielding conclusion is, take away the petri dishes before government and military bandits create more pandemics, commit more crimes, steal more trust, and further harm the health of the citizens and soldiers that they are supposed to serve and protect. Buzz dedicated his book to his late colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Russ Dingle, the intellectual leader in halting DoD's illegal anthrax vaccine mandate. All proceeds from the book go to Russ's widow. He's an outstanding individual, and I'm very happy that he agreed to come and sit down and talk with us today. What I hope to achieve is to sit back and kind of let him talk and explain his story. I will butt in here and there to guide the conversation as best I can, but I really just want his wealth of knowledge to be put out there for others to hear, and any of his advice that he might have to give to people like me or anybody in the audience that may be interested in the things we're talking about. So this is largely going to be him just going on, and that's exactly what I want. I hope to have him on in the future, and I think the work he's already done is outstanding. He is truly what it means to be still faithful. So without further ado, we are joined now by Colonel Thomas Buzz Remfer. I wanted to start by asking you about a little bit about your early life and what led you to a career in military service to begin with.
Sure. I was fortunate when I went to college that I received an appointment to the Air Force Academy. And so that's how I began my undergraduate education. And then my objective was to serve in the Air Force for a career. I ended up doing that. I ended up serving a total of 32 years in the military. So that's how it all began for me. And then, like many Air Force Academy graduates I ended up going to pilot training. And, once again, just like the undergraduate education, I was very grateful for the opportunity to be a trained pilot. I did that in the Air Force for several years. I actually did transition to the National Guard, and I continued my service in the National Guard or reserves for the latter half of my career. So I kind of had a dual track career where I was a commercial airline pilot and also a military pilot, and I owe that all to the American taxpayer, the Air Force Academy, the Air Force. And so I was very grateful for that experience. Unfortunately, partway through that experience, actually fairly early on, the anthrax vaccine mandate ended up being imposed upon military members and prematurely imposed on National Guard members. I think my former commander had recognized that, and as a result, he knew there was a lot of concern with our unit being early on told that we had to submit to the mandate. And so he actually formed a team, myself and my late colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Russ Dingle. He was actually my subordinate level commander. Our superior commander had asked us to form a team. He called it Tiger Team Alpha, and determine if there were any showstoppers, any abort level type situations that meant that the anthrax vaccine mandate would have a problem being implemented in our unit. And so we took our tasking seriously. Again, my late commander, Russ Dingle, ended up really doing the majority of the research. And he very quickly determined that the mandate was illegal, was in direct violation of U.S. law. The U.S. law was Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Section 1107. It was a fairly recent law, and it had been passed as a result of concerns with experimentation during the first Gulf War. So Congress put forth a legislation that said you could not experiment on the troops. If you were going to offer them experimental or not properly approved drug products, unapproved drug products, or investigational drug products, you had to get their informed consent. It had to be optional. And so that was basically our message to our commander is the mandate's in violation of the law. It requires our informed consent. You can't mandate it. Unfortunately, our concerns were dismissed. The mandate proceeded. We were put in a difficult position where they didn't go after us, it didn't punish us, but instead they grounded us from our flying duties. And they made it so that once we weren't flying anymore, we would not be complying with our job requirements, and they would end up out processing us from our military positions that required us to be performing duties as 810 forward air controllers. So we saw what they were doing. They were trying to essentially administrative discharge us. So we transferred over to other non-flying billets that did not require the vaccination. It was an unapproved medical product. The military knew it was an unapproved medical product. They'd actually been trying to get it properly approved for years. They'd actually recognized that the vaccine was inadequate for years. They knew that it was investigational, had submitted specific applications to try to get it out of investigational status so that it was compliant under 10 USC 1107. They were unsuccessful. During this time frame, the Food and Drug Administration was conducting inspections of the plant. They'd issued the manufacturer a notice of intent to revoke its license. So all of this was going on in the background. And so it was a mandate and a program with major malfunctions, abort level, no-go type scenario. And unfortunately, our chain of command should have listened to us. It would have stopped a great deal of future problems related to the vaccine because they ended up continuing the mandate. Federal courts got involved. I was involved with a federal court case that was known as Doe v. Rumsfeld. And in that federal court case, the judge concurred with us that you can't treat soldiers as guinea pigs. The mandate was absolutely illegal. The judge ended up stopping the program, halting it with an injunction. So enjoining the program, halting it. And during the time frame that it was halted, they actually came up with a new law called the Emergency Use Authorization. That law was passed so that an unapproved medical product could still be offered to the troops, allowed to be used, but strictly under a voluntary basis. The Federal Register's entries made at the time, 2005, specifically said there could be no penalty, no loss of benefits, no loss of entitlements if a service member refused to accept an unapproved medical product authorized under EUA. And then, as your generation of service members understands, the COVID shots that were offered, over 20 years later, basically the Department of Defense, unfortunately, making the same mistakes because they really never did a debrief. They never looked at the, lessons learned. They never did an after action report. And so as a result, they stepped into the same minefield. And unfortunately, for probably political reasons, they mandated COVID shots on our troops, blatantly illegal. And so we're very fortunate. Your generation's very fortunate that our new Department of Defense leadership has acknowledged that the COVID shots were unlawful, just as the anthrax vaccine mandate was previously unlawful, this time violating 10 USC 1107A of the US Code, the subset of the US Code that allowed emergency use authorizations, and only allowed them because they put that law into effect right after the anthrax mandate was declared illegal. They created a workaround to allow the Department of Defense to voluntarily offer unapproved medical products to our troops, but unfortunately they violated that law too. And so that kind of brings us, fast forward to the current situation where, fortunately, Department of Defense has acknowledged the wrongdoing, has acknowledged the injustices, and is trying to correct records for our troops. And unfortunately, that's never happened for the anthrax vaccine. There was a short period of time during the 2018 timeframe where President Trump had and the White House had directed the Department of Defense to correct records for anthrax era veterans, but they were totally undermined. It basically never happened. Just a handful of troops had their records corrected. And so, in addition to the Department of Defense honorably doing the right thing for COVID era veterans, I think they need to go back and I think they need to make the corrections for anthrax era veterans as well. For anthrax era veterans, I think the task is much simpler. So many years have gone by, over 2 decades. And so we're not looking at reinstatements being a viable path, but we are, I think, in an arena where they could absolutely do zero cost administrative record corrections, upgrade discharges to fully honorable, because they punished, a large number of troops. Thousands of troops were punished. It would be a very easy task to go back and go ahead and correct the records of the troops. As a matter of fact, the Congress had ordered the Department of Defense via the National Defense Authorization Act back in the 2001 timeframe, 10 USC 1178. It's very simple. It's like 2 lines. It says the Department of Defense needs to track anthrax refusals and separations. And so they just take that list that they were ordered by law to do, and they just go back and correct the records of those troops, give them fully honorable upgrades, because it was the Department of Defense that was violating the law, egregiously violating our service members' health rights that were put in place by Congress in order to protect our troops from the same kind of experimentation that had occurred during the first Gulf War. So there's a lot of history. Good news is all the facts, all the rulings at this point, from the General Accounting Office to the Congress to the courts, everybody's agreed that the anthrax vaccine program was problematic. Today, everybody agrees that the COVID shot mandate was unlawful. And so now we're in a remedy and reconciliation place. And the Department of Defense just needs to efficiently correct records for both eras of veterans. That's the background, Andrew.
That's so much information, it's like a fire hydrant. I'd like to break down, to start with, some of the some of the ways the establishment undermined certain processes to that affected anthrax veterans, and I'm trying to kind of draw a parallel to how they're operating now with COVID. There's nothing new under the sun. I believe that, and I'm sure a lot of the same tactics they used against y'all are some of the tactics they're using against, for example, people that are seeking reinstatement right now. Would you mind breaking down some of that, some of the ways the command might have retaliated against troops or honed in on them for their decision?
Sure. And I've tried to document this on hopingforjustice.org and unyielding.org. With Hoping for Justice, it's using the number four, no kidding, the number, hopingforjustice.org. Unyielding.org goes to that same website, specifically to the tab or the page related to my book. Because I saw this all happening again to COVID era veterans, I did try to document the lessons learned in my book, Unyielding. And the Unyielding story is dedicated to my late colleague that I had mentioned before, Russ Dingle. He was the intellectual heavyweight researching, discovering these egregious violations of the law by our Department of Defense leadership. All profits from the book go to his family, to his widow. Um, but as far as the injustices meted out against our generation of service members, it's interesting. You take my case, right? I'm an anthrax vaccine refuser, well documented, very vocal, very public, testified to Congress. Yet I'm probably not on that list that was formulated as a result of 10 USC 1178, because ultimately I had no adverse personnel actions taken against me. Now you compare that to other service members, other former Marines like yourself, that were actually punished. And what they tried to do was, an anthrax vaccine refusal would occur, but then they would lap on additional punishments, additional disciplinary actions, and they might even say that this service member can't follow orders. And then they gave him the anthrax vaccine mandate order again. And so now it's a pattern of misconduct. They might not have ever actually documented that there was an anthrax vaccine refusal behind all of the allegations of insubordinations, the allegations of failure to follow orders, the allegations of patterns of misconduct. And so by the time a service member, like the ones that I document on my website, made it to a court martial, it's not about anthrax vaccine. It's simply about failure to follow orders or insubordination or patterns of misconduct. And so the official documentary record might not even include anthrax vaccine refusal in it. Similarly, in the COVID era, my understanding, my suspicion would be that there's many service members that refused the COVID shots. And then there probably began a process of confusing the administrative record with other disciplinary actions, other administrative corrective actions, other potentially non-judicial punishment type actions, so that by the time a service member was actually discharged, somewhere underneath the underlying reason of COVID shot refusal that began this cascading series of events that led to a service member's discharge might not even be in the official administrative record. Or today, for the Department of Defense officials that are reviewing discharges, they might not actually see that COVID shot refusal was the causal event, and all of the rest of the disciplinary action happened subsequent to that. I'm encouraged that the Department of Defense has actually announced that they're doing a review, a proactive review of COVID era veterans' records, and they're planning on unilaterally, preemptively, proactively upgrading discharges for up to 4,000 service members that they realize received general discharges. Those need to be upgraded to fully honorable discharges. The Department of Defense knows that, recognizes it. They're frankly taking unprecedented steps to proactively review and upgrade discharges. The problem is they're probably going to miss thousands, tens of thousands of service members' records that similarly were discharged for COVID shot refusal, and but they may have received general discharges, but they don't see that they're specifically related to COVID shot refusal because the chain of command, I think, nefariously, irresponsibly, suspiciously would create a paper trail after the COVID shot refusal that would make it look like the COVID shot refusal wasn't the causal event, and it might not even be in the administrative record, might not even be on the paperwork related to the general discharge. So it's important that the Department of Defense understands these nefarious tactics and looks a couple layers below the administrative record and make sure that they understand that it all started with COVID shot refusal, and the chain of command sought to obscure what they were doing to the service member who had refused the COVID shot, because many in the chain of command recognized at the time that what they were doing was actually not lawful. And so they tried to create a pattern of misconduct, paperwork mess, in order to make it difficult for a subsequent administrative review to understand this all began with the chain of command issuing an unlawful order, and then they ended up making a discharge look like it was for something else. It's not honorable. I think the Department of Defense would admit that. That's why they're going ahead and doing a proactive review, but hopefully they do a deep enough dive to discover service members' cases that might at first glance not look like COVID shot refusals.
Right, absolutely. It's my fear that they've already begun to data dump a lot of that paperwork anyway to make it even harder for service members to seek recourse or to prove their case. But I'd like to take a step back and discuss your late colleague and the subject of your book. You mentioned him earlier as being the intellectual heavyweight of a lot of this. Could you expound on that a bit?
Sure. So Russ was the leader of our team. Our team told the chain of command the anthrax vaccine mandate is legal. Later on, General Accounting Office reports, congressional reports, the lone congressional report published related to the anthrax vaccine mandate was called Unproven Force Protection. The report said that the program was not being implemented in accordance with the law. Later, it took the federal court intervention to verify that the whole mandate was illegal, just as we had originally told our chain of command. Russ was the leader of that team. Russ also transferred to the Air Force Reserves to a non-flying billet, and he was basically in charge of recruiting Air Force Academy candidates. That was his job. I had a different job and ended up serving for many, many years. Sadly, Russ ended up getting a fatal illness. He passed away. But honestly, our effort from our era is dedicated to him because he is the guy that discovered that the anthrax vaccine mandate was illegal for a multitude of reasons, not just because the Department of Defense knew as early as 1985 in research that he uncovered. He was actually invited to the Congress, to one of the congressional archive rooms, to go through the subpoenaed information that came from the Department of Defense's Joint Project Office for Biological Defense, JPOBD. And the congressional officials let him go through the archives in order to pull out some of the most damning paperwork. Some of that paperwork was applications that were filed just a couple of years prior to the mandate, where the Department of Defense was trying to get the vaccine properly approved. Those applications were still pending. Russ had discovered all of that for the congressional officials. Russ had also discovered that the manufacturing process for the vaccine had actually been altered, not just altered, but illegally altered. And in FDA parlance, they refer to it as adulteration. They had changed the manufacturing process actually prior to the first Gulf War, so almost 10 years earlier. Department of Defense officials, in the run-up to the first Gulf War and in the call by Department of Defense leaders to have sufficient amount of anthrax vaccine that worked. They knew it didn't work properly. They knew it was inadequate. So they illegally changed the manufacturing process prior to the first Gulf War. Department of Defense officials were in part responsible for those illegal manufacturing changes. And they were implemented. The vaccine was altered prior to the first Gulf War. As we know, hundreds of thousands of people ended up complaining of autoimmune type illnesses after the first Gulf War. And anthrax vaccine was the largest exposure during the first Gulf War to biologic substances. And so the Department of Defense, sadly, Department of Veteran Affairs, similarly, have not even gone back and researched whether the anthrax vaccine was a possible cause of Gulf War illness. Unfortunately, that's the modus operandi. That's what they do. They know perfectly well that anthrax vaccine is the primary cause of Gulf War illness, so they've gone out of their way to not study it, and they've come up with a variety of other toxic exposures that are essentially the excuse. Most of those toxic exposures are incidents that really aren't the Department of Defense's fault. The thing that was the Department of Defense's fault, the largest exposure, was anthrax vaccine. They illegally altered the drug product prior to the first Gulf War, gave it to our troops, and then made sure that they did not investigate it as a possible cause. So Russ is really was the architect of putting together these arguments. Another argument that he came up with was the idea that because these manufacturing changes were illegally implemented, the vaccine was altered. He also discovered that the vaccine license had been proposed to be finalized by the Food and Drug Administration in 1985. Right, there was a proposed rule published in the Federal Register that properly approved by the Food and Drug Administration. It was never finalized. So that similarly was one of the foundational discoveries by Russ. And we actually filed a citizen petition in the 2001 timeframe. And we said, hey, the vaccine hasn't been properly licensed by the Food and Drug Administration. And the Food and Drug Administration came back 1 year later, 2002, and agreed. They acknowledged it. They said, you're right. Russ Dingle was absolutely correct. The vaccine license needs to be finalized, but they didn't do anything about it. So it took the federal courts to shut the program down, cite the citizen petition, cite Russ specifically in the federal court ruling, and as a result of the vaccine license not being finalized. And so that became a foundational basis of the court ruling to shut the anthrax vaccine mandate down until they licensed the vaccine properly. They did that several years later. By the 2005 to 2007 timeframe, they did publish a final vaccine rule, and this was after they used the emergency use authorization law in order to allow temporary voluntary use of the vaccine. So we owe that all to Russ Dingle. He was the intellectual force behind all of these discoveries, whether it be adulteration, investigational use, not finalized license. And the amazing thing is the Department of Defense knew all of this at the time. And so to me, it was beyond dereliction of duty that they would go ahead and mandate a shot that was, being ordered for the troops to take despite all of these malfunctions, all of these abort level, no-go type situations, and they did it anyway, blatantly violating U.S. law. And so, unfortunately, that is a parallel we saw with COVID shots. With COVID shots, they knew perfectly well that only emergency use authorized, unapproved medical products actually existed. Those medical products were allowed or authorized under a different regulatory standard than an FDA approved product. During the mandate, during literally all of the deadlines of the mandates, there were no FDA approved COVID shots even available. And so the Department of Defense, once again, exhibited the same bad behavior, and they mandated COVID shots on our troops, even though they knew it was blatantly unlawful to do so. And so that's a really important pattern. And for my generation of veterans, Russ Dingle was really the intellectual force behind those discoveries.
Outstanding. He sounds like an outstanding individual to be able to uncover all of that. Just thinking about piecing it all together from my own perspective is I can only imagine. I don't know. It's crazy to me that he was able to uncover all of that in the time frame that he did, especially considering the internet wasn't what it is today. And I attribute a lot of the success to COVID era vets today to social media and the internet being as instant as it is. I feel like things would have been different for y'all if that had been a thing the way it is today back then. I see so many parallels. The Gulf War disease, that just sounds like myocarditis and blood clots. And then at the end of that whole story, they're being drugged, kicking and screaming to correct these things after congressional hearing after congressional hearing. And I really hope y'all get the recognition that y'all deserve. This has been far too long, this fight that
Well,
y'all have been a part of.
and the good news is President Trump actually did try. I worked directly with White House advisors in the early part of his first term, and they were responsive. They did tell the Department of Defense to fix this. Department of Defense, unfortunately, crafted a memo, didn't even mention anthrax vaccine in the memo to correct errors, injustices, and inequities. They didn't even publish the memo. And so, in no uncertain terms, Department of Defense officials essentially undermined the president's intent and the White House's directive to get this fixed for anthrax era veterans. And I don't know what the holdup is, but I think there should be a review of anthrax era veterans' injustices, which are equal to that of COVID era veterans. COVID era veteran injustices are even more egregious just because they'd already done this before with anthrax, and it was a total disaster. We ended up having a great deal of not only public support, media support, but also support from leaders. H. Ross Perot had reached out to me early on and set up meetings with numerous elected officials, Senator Warner, Senator Daschle, Gephardt, their staffs, and also the White House. Karl Rove personally contacted me, asked for information, put underway a review of the entire anthrax vaccine fiasco, recognized, quote unquote, that it was a political problem for the Bush administration, and they did try to fix it. They actually recommended to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld at the time to stop the program. Unfortunately, all of that was undermined by the anthrax letter attacks, which happened right after the tragedies of 9/11. And so, on the heels of 9/11, the anthrax letter attacks created a situation where the cancellation of the anthrax vaccine program and probably correction of military records would have occurred were it not for the anthrax letter attacks on the heels of 9/11. Fear bombs were put in place, basically false flag attack, essentially an insider attack event. Ultimately, the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation determined 10 years later that the anthrax letter attacks originated from an Army scientist inside Fort Detrick. It was a lab leak, and the motive was to save the failing anthrax vaccine program. Problem was, it took 10 years for them to make this determination, and therefore, senators like Senator Daschle that we've been working with, who had actually questioned the punishments meted out, unfortunately, they never went back and took another look at the records that Senator Daschle was asking them to review and the punishments that they were had meted out against the troops. So Senator Daschle, ironically, was one of the senators attacked on Capitol Hill with anthrax, and they were successful in shutting him up. He never asked another question of the Department of Defense, to the best of my knowledge, about correction of military records. And 10 years later, when it was determined that it was an inside job, unfortunately, no elected officials anywhere went back and said, okay, how about that anthrax vaccine program that you were going to cancel 10 years ago, and minimize use of the vaccine and develop a doctrinally coherent way of dealing with these threats in the future? Unfortunately, nobody ever went back, resurveyed their judgments, and looked at the things that needed to be fixed. And so nobody ever did until President Trump came in 2018, and he said, "Hey, let's go back and fix this." And then he was undermined. He wasn't reelected, but now that he's been reelected and it isn't in his second term, I think it is incumbent on his administration to go back and fix what they already knew needed to be fixed. And the fix was only stopped because of the anthrax letter attacks, an inside job, a lab leak from Fort Detrick, affirmed by the FBI and the Department of Justice. It's time to go back and fix it. They're doing the honorable right thing for COVID era veterans. Every justification is there to go back and do the right thing for anthrax era veterans also.
Absolutely. They can't keep kicking this can down the road. It's got to come to a head at some point. I hope sooner rather than later. Next, I want to ask your advice, but I want to ask it in tiers. First, I would ask, what advice would you have to those currently serving on COVID task forces within the DoD? What advice would you give those individuals in their efforts to correct some of this stuff from within?
Yeah, for the good folks that are working on those task forces, some of them are COVID era veterans that suffered these injustices. So I'm very impressed that the Department of Defense has brought those people in, but you need to give them the tools. One suggestion I've had from the very beginning, and I think those veterans also have the same objective, is to unilaterally correct all records, do a reset, bring everybody back on status, and start paying them again. Unfortunately, they've encountered significant bureaucratic obstacles to bringing troops back on board. And so, my professional suggestion would be bring everybody that was negatively impacted by the COVID shots. The unlawful COVID shots should never have been taken off pay status. They should never have been kicked out of the military. Put them all back on status, pay them all of the back pay that they deserve, and issue them all orders in order to come back into the armed forces. If a service member decides that they do not want to come back into the armed forces, terminate the orders as of that date and stop the pay and pay them the back pay that they are due. The only way to make the system work is to do a full reset, bring everybody back on status, and force the system to actually bring those troops back, and then make a decision on whether or not they're going to continue service or not. So I believe that that would be the most efficient way to make it happen. Some people might think that that's going to be too costly. These service members pay the distributions from Congress to pay for these troops. They were already authorized. That money was already allocated by the United States Congress. So that money is out there someplace. If it was misallocated to not pay for those service members' pay, they call it milpers. If they didn't use the money and aren't using the money to give these soldiers their back pay, then find out where that money is and reallocate it and make sure that you pay everybody their back pay. And unfortunately, this process is taking a long time. The only way to expedite it is to do a strategic reset and put everybody back on orders.
I agree. I don't think that sounds too far at all. Like you said, the money was already allocated, it was already approved, and that seems the most practical way to deal with that situation. It makes me wonder why that hasn't been thought of yet, or if it has, why it hasn't been implemented. For those going in and seeking either reinstatement into their former positions or some sort of recompense or correction for their records and what happened to them, what advice would you have for those individuals? Because I know there's tens of thousands of them.
Yeah. Department of Defense at one point said, hey, there's probably 8,400 or 8,700. They've admitted there were 4,000 that received less than fully honorable discharges. So, they are doing the research to figure out how many people were impacted. They fully recognize that there are tens and tens of thousands of additional troops that were negatively impacted. For those troops, I would tell them that you're living through an unprecedented era where you actually have honorable Department of Defense officials in the Undersecretary of Defense Office for Personnel and Readiness and throughout the services as well that are actually trying to do the right thing. And so I think that troops need to put in applications to the Board for Correctional Military Records, even if some of them will proactively hear from the Department of Defense and get fully honorable discharges. Everybody needs to fill out a DD 149 and send it in and ask for a fully honorable discharge, ask for any adverse personnel actions to be rescinded, ask for any career setbacks to be mitigated or remedied. The Department of Defense officials have already said they're going to do all of this. Our Secretary of War Pete Hegseth has already publicly or in written correspondence and memos already affirmed that they're going to do all of those things: remedy career setbacks, remove adverse personnel actions, upgrade discharges. So they've already committed to do all of that, but service members may need to do their part, put in an application in order to highlight their case to the Department of Defense, because they may not even be aware of that individual service member's circumstances. Again, because the Department of Defense officials during the previous administrations did nefarious activities in order to try to hide and obscure the discharges and make them look like they were unrelated to COVID shot refusal.
Okay, absolutely. I think that sounds like fantastic advice. I know many individuals that are seeking reinstatement are having trouble with the recruiting agencies. And by that I mean in the Marine Corps case, in several cases I know of personally, what they're doing instead of categorizing these individuals as reinstatees and giving them the back pay and the corrections that they need, they'll correct their records, data dump the rest or anything that had to do with COVID. That's kind of the trade-off I'm seeing is it's like a way for them to cover their own rear end. I think they've already deleted a lot of these records. I think this is a way for people to be mass corrected, yes, but then they get to say, okay, we're going to data dump everything as if they're doing that now and they didn't do that back then. That's what I think's going on. But in addition to that, these recruiting agencies, a lot of the times they're miscategorizing, I think intentionally, reinstatees as prior service reenlistments. So they're not entitled to any of the back pay. They're probably not going to get the same positions that they held before. I think that's an effort to, and this may be small-minded, I don't think it is. I think that's an effort to obscure the number of people that are coming back in, obscure how interested people are. Because if I understand this correctly, don't they only have until April to for the reinstatement program to persist? I don't think that it's been approved to be extended past that point.
Right. So I think that the original deadline was put in place to encourage people to try to come back on board as quickly as possible. Based on the documented intransigence and bureaucratic interference that has occurred, I fully expect that the Department of Defense will extend that deadline. But again, the solution I'm talking about um, obviates these human bad behavior type things that are being imposed. If you put everybody back on orders, anybody that was discharged over COVID shots, you just reinstate them to orders, start their pay again, tell them to report. If they choose not to report, you stop their pay and you only give them back pay up till that date. Because again, let's think about this. They were all unlawfully discharged. They never should have been discharged in the first place. The Department of Defense does the right thing. They put them back on orders, and you have outflanked the bad behavior of the recruiters or any other bureaucrat that is trying to slow roll reinstatements.
Absolutely. I do think that's the end all solution. Absolutely.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's been almost a year since the president's executive order. Department of Defense recognizes there's been a lot of problems. They have committed to going ahead and doing this right. I fully believe that they have contemplated a strategic reset at the highest levels. The Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, Anthony Tata, himself has acknowledged literally publicly that maybe some kind of a strategic reset is in order. hopefully they are sufficiently frustrated and disappointed with the subordinate bureaucracies within the Department of Defense that they actually might just go ahead and do a strategic reset and put every service member that was discharged unlawfully over COVID shots back on military status, back on pay. And you would be amazed at how quickly those bureaucracies will then deal with those service members to try to get a declination for accepting the new orders, to try to get them off pay status as quickly as possible, or to actually put them someplace on duty, because in the meantime, they're sitting at home getting paid. Those bureaucracies will suddenly snap into action, salute smartly, and they will start working as rapidly as possible to stop people's pay or get them to actually work in some productive manner. So that's the way to overcome the deleterious, negative impacts of these bureaucracies.
That would be outstanding. That would be absolutely outstanding. I'm all here. I'm all for that. Well, sir, I thank you so much for the amount of time that you've been able to give me. Would you mind telling people a little bit more about your book and where they can find that and your other work?
Sure. So, Children's Health Defense, run by RFK Jr. before he became the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary, sponsored the book. They are what they call the imprint for the book. Skyhorse Publishing, grateful to Skyhorse Publishing, as well as Children's Health Defense, has put out the book. It is available on Amazon, all the other book websites. As I mentioned, all of the profits go to the widow of my colleague. I don't touch any money. Don't want anything but to do, hopefully a kindness for this family. And so, yeah, if people want to hear about some of the history, I try to draw a lot of the parallels. Talk about our rules of engagement, how we tried to dispassionately attack the program without getting in trouble ourselves, and how to pursue records corrections. The book is rather meaty. There is a lot of history, but there's only a lot of history because it's only by understanding the historical timeline that you can understand the egregious violations that occurred during anthrax, and even more importantly, be absolutely upset that they did it all again to our COVID era veterans. So while the historical timeline might seem like kind of a meaty read, there's a lot of historical data points. Hopefully, there are some useful tools for people to use in getting their own records corrections. The most important rule of engagement, I think, is not going away, not letting them get away with it, being unyielding. And the way I look at it is, by doing so, you won't have regrets. It can be a laborious process, but from a COVID era veterans standpoint, they are so fortunate. They should be so grateful that our current president and new Secretary of Defense and Department of Defense leadership are supporting them. They're trying to do the right thing. And if we had tens of thousands of COVID era veterans highlight their cases to the Department of Defense and made the Department of Defense realize what the true numbers are and the incredible bad behavior by the chain of command that was trying to cover up these discharges, the voluminous number of discharges, I think that would be something that they would not regret. And I think that they would have a good chance of getting their records corrected, getting back pay. And so I encourage everybody to do it. And hopefully my book is a motivation for troops to do that. And, again, the anthrax era veterans plight is absolutely black and white documented. The program was patently illegal, violated U.S. law as affirmed by courts and the Department of Defense and the Congress. So hopefully the new Department of Defense leadership will grab this one and say, hey, this is an easy fix. We can do the right thing for these veterans. President Trump already told the Department of Defense to fix this, make it right, give justice. And so I have every confidence that once they realize the egregious nature of these violations and the attempt by deep state type entities to cover this up and not correct records for Anthrax era veterans, I have every confidence that they're going to do the right thing.
From your lips to God's ears. Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Colonel Remfer, for taking the time to talk about anthrax and its parallels to COVID. I think there's a lot there, and I encourage anybody that watches this to search your website and to order your book. I know I'm going to directly after this. So thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Andrew. Good luck to everybody, and get those applications in so the Department of Defense has the information to understand the depth of deceit that occurred.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Take care.
So that was our interview with Colonel Remfer. I felt like it was a fire hose of information the entire time. There's so much he has to share and so much he knows. I hope that anybody that watched this was able to get as much as I did out of this conversation. He's exactly right. I think there are very quick and easy fixes to a lot of this stuff, but it's the willpower and the drive, and we'll see if we can drive public opinion enough to elicit certain results. We can only do so much with who we know and who we interact with, but the more that these videos go out there and the more that y'all come on and talk with me and share what's going on, the more we can generate that conversation and actually hopefully hammer in, just like he did with Anthrax. Him and Lieutenant Colonel Dingle, they did the same thing. They were in the same, except they didn't have the benefit of the internet and podcasting. So we should step up our game. I mean, look at what they were able to accomplish. Now, granted, there's still a lot, that needs to be done in their case. They really kind of kicked that can down the road. Not to say that they achieved total victory. The strides they made is the groundwork that we can operate from. Knowing the past is going to help dictate our next steps. So I think this is a very important conversation, and please check him out. Check out his book on Amazon. Again, all the proceeds to it go directly to the widow of Lieutenant Colonel Russ Dingle, which is great. And yeah, support his book. Check out his website that he mentions in the episode. Support the Still Faithful Project and our podcast. If you or anybody you know would be interested in coming on the show and talking about what happened, please reach out. I'll talk to anybody. The content is the content. It's just getting the word out, really. So the more people, the merrier. Join the Still Faithful Project on X and follow me everywhere else. I'm on Rumble, RowdyRob37, TikTok, RowdyRob37, YouTube, Still Faithful Project. So go check those out and continue to support us. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please leave positive feedback. Goodbye.